Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Anna Rose Canzano. I'm the Exhibition and Programming Associate at the Venda. Thanks so much for tuning in today for Cold War Spaces. Today's topic is border space, Checkpoint Charlie, and the Berlin Wall. And we're so happy to welcome Iain MacGregor today. He's a London-based editor and publisher of nonfiction and a graduate of modern history. He's the author of To Hell on a Bike, Riding Paris-Roubaix, The Toughest Race in Cycling, and Checkpoint Charlie, The Cold War, the Berlin Wall, and the Most Dangerous Place on Earth. It's an exploration of the history surrounding the Berlin Wall through the lens of interwoven first-person experiences, based on his extensive interviews with people living on both sides of the wall. And you can see the image of the book behind him. Today's program will be about a 30-minute conversation between Iain and Joes Segal, the Venda's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll leave about 15 minutes for Q&A, so please get your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. As always, we appreciate everyone's questions, but we ask that you please keep them short and concise, no longer than a sentence or two, so that we can try to get to everyone's. And for any other comments or discussion, please use the chat box. As we're getting started, feel free to say hi. It's always nice to see what city you're tuning in from. And a quick reminder to change the blue box in the chat box to attendees and panelists, not just panelists, so that everyone can see your messages. We'll be posting the recording of this program on our Vimeo page and in podcast format on our SoundCloud page. And lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Venda and our virtual programs. And now I'll pass it to you to get started. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much, Anna Rose, and Iain, welcome to the series. And also a special shout out to John Ahaus, our former Special Collections archivist, who was so instrumental in the history of the Wende Museum. And I think he supported you with the research of your book as well. So I'm very happy he's with us today.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, it's an honor to be associated with a presentation with the Venda, because like you said, I've been working with the museum for the last 3 or 4 years, just getting snippets of information and ideas and recommendations of people I could speak to when I was researching my book.
Right, wonderful, yeah. So speaking about your book, Checkpoint Charlie, it's a very special take on the history of the Berlin Wall, as you interviewed a lot of people, I think about 80 people, from military personnel to journalists, politicians, people who happen to live in East or West Berlin. So my first question to you is, first of all, how did you find all these people? But also, did you find their stories sometimes hard to match with what we know from the traditional Cold War history books?
Sure. Well, if we go to the first proper slide on the PowerPoint, keep going. Next one, please. That's the one. So this just gives you a glimpse of some of the people I was talking to. Like you were just saying, I interviewed 80 people. It's around roughly about 80. What I did was I set up a program of how I wanted to approach the book, and a lot of the books I publish as a history publisher are oral history. I think that's the most important type of history you can get, if it's actually from the people that have lived the events that you're talking about. And this is what I was doing with the book I was writing. So I tried to get a complete 360-degree angle on what it would have been like to have lived in Berlin just before the wall was built, and then obviously during the lifespan, the 28 years of the wall. And it was a case of, I would start with obvious choices. So I would go to, for instance, the Royal Military Police and the Gendarmerie and the US Military Police, and spoke to their veterans associations. And generally it kind of mushrooms. I think any decent history researcher or author who researches these kinds of books will have the same kind of story as I did. You talk to someone, you have a repartee with them, you get given other names, which opens other doors. And they'll say, well, I'll tell you my history, but you really should talk to my buddy or this person that I had to have dealings with at Checkpoint Charlie, for instance. They will have a story that will either back up what I've said or will have something interesting. And that's how it was. And that just wasn't from the military personnel that was serving in Berlin. It was, like you were just saying, it was civilians that lived in Berlin, East and West Berlin, children who grew up just before the wall was built, sorry. So that's what I was doing. And so here you've just got some samples. You've got 3 military policemen that are in the book. You've got James Baker, bottom right, standing next to President Bush Sr. He's interviewed for the book. And then obviously you've got the German, East German guard who jumped over the barriers that was famously on every single T-shirt you could buy in Berlin. I talked to the Allied personnel who received him and then transported him safely out of West Berlin back to West Germany.
Right. And whose story would you say was the most surprising, in the sense that you felt maybe forced to adjust your view of history as you had been taught about the Cold War in Berlin?
Well, I mean, I kind of had an idea that, well, it is obviously, it's not as black and white as we were led to believe, as you know, you and I grew up in the 70s and 80s and in the middle of when the Cold War was probably at its hottest. And it was interesting, I thought, mainly to talk to East Germans and East Berliners that were either civilians when the war was going up. And obviously, I would argue probably 80% of them were aghast and shocked, sickened, and fearful of this happening. Whereas there were others that I talked to that were in the FDJ, the youth movement of the socialist government that was there, that were young teenagers, and they'd been brought up to believe that the anti-fascist wall, as we'll talk about later, was a necessary thing to happen if they were going to protect the socialist experiment that they were building, that everyone believed in, well, in their circles anyway. So it was interesting to get those kind of viewpoints, which is what I wanted for the book. It was to say that there was a gamut of different viewpoints, political viewpoints, and that the reader should know about to understand the whole period properly.
Right, and that makes your book so lively and so interesting, because it contains all these different personal perspectives and experiences. Another question I would like to ask you, because it's always surprised me so much, the fact that to many people, including the Western allies, but also many people just living in East and West Berlin, the building of the wall in August 1961 came as a complete shock. And how is that possible, given the fact that thousands and thousands of people were involved in the preparations, transporting materials, building, checking on the workers, etc.? Why didn't that leak?
Well, if we go to the next slide, please. So I think it's interesting. I had the same opinion as many people do, that the Allies and the Western world, and obviously West Berlin themselves and East Berlin, were taken completely by surprise. And I think that still holds true. But it's like any major event that came as a surprise for one side because the other side had surprisingly attacked, so Pearl Harbor, for instance, that kind of thing. Whereas with the Berlin Wall, I think which is what I try and say in the book, because I've interviewed so many people that were there on the ground when it happened. If you look at all the snippets of information that was happening in the weeks building up to that fateful day, hindsight's a great thing, obviously, but if you look at all the information that was coming in, it probably was obvious that the East Germans were going to do something big, but obviously no one could envisage that they would do something so spectacular that they would try and hermetically seal the western half of Berlin in. So obviously not just building a wall that split the city in two, but obviously then building the barriers that surrounded the city that would then face out into the hinterland of obviously what was East German territory. So that's what I try and capture in the book, is to give it a bit of pace at the beginning for when the war was happening on August 13th and the days that either preceded that or came after it, is to say in real time, it did take the population by shock on both sides. But like I said, it's I think the realization to the Allies, if you can go to the next slide, was that as long as the East Germans weren't, and the Soviets obviously weren't going to encroach on West Berlin itself, and they were obviously just sealing in their own section of the city, I thought that was a kind of relief for the Allied powers, thinking, okay, well, this is not, the balloon hasn't gone up, so to speak. They're not going to walk into the West Berlin sectors and try and potentially start a war in Europe.
Right, right. So yeah, West Berlin actually functioned as a kind of loophole between East and West in the time of the Iron Curtain. But between 1949 and 1961, more than 2 million East Germans actually moved or fled to the West out of a population of 17 million, which of course is a lot. And then, as you mentioned in your book, about half of them were under the age of 25. So East Germany really lost a lot of potential there. What did that do with the morale in East Germany? How did people experience this situation?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I would argue that people were just getting on with life. As you were saying just now, 50% of those that did leave were under 25, and the vast majority of those were professionals, or they were undertaking professional training to become teachers, architects, engineers, doctors, etc. And that's the lifeblood of any economy anywhere in the world. So to lose those kind of people, they were the ones that could see that the future that was opening up for them, or that's the wrong term, not opening up, the future that was closing in on them, that their careers could be curtailed, their monetary earning power would definitely be curtailed under the system that they were working in, where if you didn't kowtow to the political regime that was in charge and go along with the system, then your avenues or your career paths would definitely be in danger. So they were the ones that could see that we have to leave. And as I show in this map, Berlin is obviously 70 miles into East German territory, as had ended by the end of the Second World War. Berlin had been turned into an international city. That hadn't changed, and the four superpowers were still having their own sections of Berlin. And that was the problem. It was, even though you can see the very hard border that separates East and West Germany, that's the intra-German border that was set up in the early 50s by Stalin after the failure of the Berlin airlift. So it was quite hard, if not impossible, to get across from East Germany into West Germany because of that border that was heavily guarded and fortified. The loophole, as you say, was Berlin, because the crossing points back then were very, very porous, to the point where tens of thousands of people every month were taking their chances with a small suitcase or sometimes not carrying anything, and being able to cross into the city as we all do. Obviously not in lockdown, but I cross London all the time to go to meetings, go to work, that kind of thing. That's what people were still doing in East and West Berlin. They were allowed to cross. And that's what the East Germans, with the Soviet acknowledgement, had to stop. Otherwise, the brain drain was just going to carry on.
Right. I get it. You mentioned also paradoxically that the first time the word wall, Mauer, was actually used was in a press conference with Walter Ulbricht, state leader of East Germany, saying that no one has any intention to erect a wall, which of course afterwards he said is only 2 months before the wall was actually built. So would you say this is a typical example of Orwellian doublespeak, so to speak, or was it really true that 2 months in advance of August 1961, even Walter Ulbricht wasn't aware what was going to happen?
Oh no, he was. If we go to the next slide, please. He was very aware of what he'd like to happen. He'd been badgering Nikita Khrushchev, who was obviously first secretary of the Soviet Union. He was the new guy, well, not the new guy, but he was in charge. He had been having secret talks and not so secret talks with Khrushchev and the other Warsaw Pact leaders for a good time, probably a year and a half, even if not 2 years or more, saying the situation had to change, something had to give. Whether he was being listened to, that's a different matter. But by the time of early summer, so May, June 1961, it was a serious problem. And that's where the plans on paper were then being seriously talked about what materiel would the East Germans need, how many troops would they need to guard all the exits and the crossing points to ensure the workers could build these barriers, how could they ship in the materials into Germany undetected. All these conversations were going on, and it was probably around June time. He had the plans, he had the people. We can go to the next slide, please. Those are refugees, by the way, coming in. This kind of shows you why the refugees were moving through. On the right-hand side there, you've got the cyclist on the Kudamm, the famous street in Berlin, where everything the West had to offer you could find on the Kudamm, a huge long boulevard of shops, nightclubs, cafes, restaurants, amazing place. On the other side, on the left, you've got, by the early 60s, this is just off a side street, off one of the main thoroughfares in East Berlin, and you could see the place was still rubble from the Second World War. And interestingly, what I found out in the research, which gets back to about your point about Ulbricht saying we have no point in building a wall, the East Germans were very, very short of material even to reconstruct East Berlin itself. A lot of the materials they were stockpiling to, say, build new flats for the workers, rebuild thoroughfares, that kind of thing, actually went into the construction of the wall in August 61, which is why it took another few years to catch up and build more social housing for the workforce.
Right, right. So when the wall was built, many people were anxious and curious to see how the Allied powers would respond. But basically, they did nothing. Why was that?
If you go to the next slide as well, please. Yeah, so here you've got factory fighting workers, the militia, with their Russian submachine guns, and they're backed up by water cannon. And in the distance behind them, you can see regular East German troops in armored cars. So again, before I did the proper research and started interviewing guys like this who are actually in the militia and in the NVA, that's the regular army, and then Allied troops that were watching them build the barriers, I just assumed that they'd encroached slightly onto Allied territory. They were building right on the border, and they were literally had their eyes trained on the West Berlin population. But obviously, you do your research and you interview people, you find out the opposite's true. So the majority of the East Germans that were there as militia and regular troops and border police were there to guard against their own people, stopping the workforce building the barriers. And that's what the orders they had. They were under orders not to fire on any Allied troops, any West Berlin police. A lot of the American military police I interviewed that were there at the time, that witnessed all this going on, told me about conversations, which I talk about in the book, of these guys, these East German militia, shouting across to them. This, obviously, they're only separated by about 20, 30 meters, saying, "Why aren't you coming over? Why don't you stop this? We haven't got any bullets in our guns." And obviously, that was in the first few days. Right. And as soon as the East Germans and Ulbricht realized the Allies aren't actually going to do anything, the first phase of just building the barbed wire then went into the next phase, which was obviously more permanent, of breeze blocks, cement, and guard towers.
And what would you think was the reason that the Western powers didn't respond? Was it that they were afraid, or was it that they maybe thought the wall wasn't a bad idea for them as well? For instance, because there was such a stream of refugees coming their direction.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Well, I mean, it was led by Kennedy's famous quote, "A war's a hell of a lot better than a war." He'd come away from a conference, his first conference as an international leader he's had in Vienna, that June, so obviously 2 months before the war went up, with Khrushchev, where Khrushchev was his normal, brilliant, belligerent best. And a very shaken Kennedy came away from that thinking, this guy's for real. He really will go to war, depending on what kind of war we have, if we really push the envelope too far with Berlin and don't try and see some concessions here. Maybe he had that going on in the back of his mind, but both sides were still cranking it up. So I suppose, yes, as soon as they realized on the ground in Berlin that they weren't getting encroached upon, that message went back up to Washington, Paris, and London. And they quickly realized, yep, we can give ground here, but as long as they still respect our rights internationally within the city to have free right of travel, if we have the right to travel into East Berlin, and if we still have that corridor of transportation from our sectors to West Germany, then we won't say anything else about it. Right. And that's exactly what happened.
Right. So once the wall was up, it evidently was hardly possible anymore to flee from the east to the west, but still people tried. And can you tell us some figures, how many people died trying to cross the wall? How many attempts were there? How many people were incarcerated?
Yeah, well, it's still quite hazy to get the full detailed statistics, purely because there were a lot of people that would have tried, but their efforts weren't recorded, and if they failed, they were obviously squirreled away by the border guards, and if they'd been injured in the attempt, they'd be in hospital. They might have even died in hospital, or they'd be in one of the Stasi prisons or federal prisons or whatever. So if you look at the actual statistics, it's roughly about 10,000 people attempted to get through the Berlin Wall over its 28-year life, and 200 and again, it's hard to tell, but it's between 200 and 250 people died, whether by shooting or by physical injuries they sustained in trying to get across the wall. So they may have actually got across the barriers, but from their wounds, they would have died when they got to West Berlin. Or like I said, quite a few were shot and wounded and were still taken back into East Berlin territory, and then they probably did die, but their records we haven't found yet.
Right. Do you know of any examples of people fleeing the other way around, from west to east?
Well, yes, there's one occasion which, again, is, you can find it if you go on YouTube or you go onto one of the Cold War history sites, which they're all very good. Is an American tank man went a bit crazy in the 1970s and crashed his Patton tank through the barriers and was just driving like a maniac down the borders until he along one of the main boulevards until he was stopped, and it wasn't hushed up or anything. It's been well reported, but that was a case of both sides realized this isn't an official attack. This is just a madman who's grabbed a vehicle and is just causing hell, and will just try and sort this out as quickly and as quietly as possible. I mean, by the late 60s, early 70s, it was in both sides' interests to try and get along for the sake of the citizens in the city in both sectors, as well as the kind of international relations, because obviously by the early 70s, East Germany was officially recognized as a state.
Right, but you don't know any examples of people from the West trying to go to the East for ideological or political reasons?
Oh, there's a few artists, like recording artists who had careers in East Germany while East Germany was still there, that traveled from America. And there's Louis Armstrong, for instance, did concerts in East Berlin. But again, they weren't very well publicized. But but like I was saying, by the late 60s and going into the 70s, the East Germans were very much more relaxed about who they let in to have a look around what they hoped would show their perfect capital city, Hauptstadt, as they called it, obviously. Right. And if you get someone of Louis Armstrong's stature who wants to come in and play in a club or in a theatre, or one of their grand theatres, I should say, they weren't going to say no. But the East German experiment had lots of supporters, but it was, I would say, the flood of people trying to escape the other way far outweighs it.
No, for sure. Yeah. So as mentioned, there are so many interesting personal stories in your book, and I would like to ask you to illustrate one of them, and I give you the choice with an eye on the time. Whether
sure,
you want
I'll
to
be very
speak
quick
about the singing Jew of Checkpoint Charlie, if you, as you call him in your book, or Adolf Knackstedt, who actually was, I think, the product of a chance encounter and then became one of the protagonists of your book.
If we go to the next slide, I'll shoot through these ones. So I know we're on a time limit. And the next one, please. So they are the people that organized the Berlin Wall from left to right: Walter Ulbricht, Erich Honecker, and Erich Milke. Sorry. And this is Checkpoint Charlie. Next slide, please. This is Checkpoint Charlie as it looked once the barriers had gone up. As you can see, it's far more militarized than it is nowadays, where we have the reenactors. But if we can go to the next slide as well, please. So these are just two stories. I'll be very quick. On your left-hand side, the young boy being carried away it was a huge story when it happened in August 62. So this is a year after the wall had gone up, and Peter Fechter was an 18-year-old East German schoolboy. He'd left school, he was a bricklayer by then, he was an apprentice. And he was just, I call it the death of Elvis, the chapter where I talk about him. And this kind of photograph went round the world when it was taken. He was one of two friends who tried to escape across what was now the death zone, and his friend managed to escape, and he was shot. I think 35 shots were fired at him, 3 hit him, and he was mortally wounded. And the thing was, because he was almost lying in a no man's land, the East German guards didn't have the orders to go and get him just then. The American guards at Checkpoint Charlie weren't going to go into East German territory to offer first aid, for that very reason, that it was no man's land. So by the time he bled to death, there were hundreds and hundreds of West Berliners watching this spectacle, and the world's media captured it too. And there's a monument just around the corner from where Checkpoint Charlie stands today that's been kept there since he died. But it's obviously, it's a big cobalt-looking plinth there now. And I go there, every time I go to Berlin, I go there and lay flowers, because it's just such a sad story, which I can't do justice to in a couple of minutes. You'd have to read the book or go and research it, but it was tragic what happened to him. But on a positive side, the couple on the right, that's Peter Spitzner and with his daughter Peggy, and he was one of the very last people to escape from East to West Berlin, and he did it a few weeks before the wall actually fell down. And they they lived in Chemnitz, and he was fed up of the life he was leading. He was trying to be a teacher, but because he wasn't politically motivated, all his paths were blocked. He'd been picked up by the Stasi quite a few times. So in the end, they snuck out of East Berlin by an American soldier who was on leave looking through East Berlin, picked them up in his car, hid them in his boot, and transported them through Checkpoint Charlie. And this is them literally 2 days after they'd got through, and they're by now they're in West Germany, sorry. And they couldn't believe they were free. And obviously, in hindsight, he never knew the wall was going to be coming down in a few weeks later. But he's one of the last escapees from East Germany.
Nice. Yeah.
And then if we go to the next slide. So this is Strongen Nakama. Now I call this chapter the Singing Jew of Berlin, and it's an amazing story. He was born in 1918 in Salonika in Greece. He came from a very academic religious family, where he was going to go into become a cantor. He had an amazing baritone voice, which he was famous for at the start of the war. But then when the war came and Greece was overrun by the Germans, him and his family were transported to Auschwitz in 1943. All his family perished there. He survived. He survived being transported to Sachsenhausen. He survived the death marches. And by 1947, to skip quickly to the story, he ended up in Berlin, where he thought he was going to catch a train back to Greece. But he decided to stay because there was still quite a small community of Jews living in Berlin. And before the war, there'd been over 56,000 Jews, a big, strong community living in Berlin. They'd all gone, they'd all been deported. Well, not all, but there was a few thousand left. And so for the next, until he died in the year 2000, he was arguably the heartbeat of the Jewish community on East and West Berlin. And when the wall went up, because of his Greek citizenship, there was an anomaly where he was allowed to travel quite freely from West Berlin into East Berlin. In West Berlin, he was more to do with ceremonial duties, as a cantor would do, but he was mainly going into East Berlin to the very small elderly Jewish community that was there. It's probably only 300-400 of them. And as they were dying, he would go over there to give them the proper funeral, and that's why he was allowed to go over. But surreptitiously underneath that, he was taking in gifts and luxury goods like coffee and sugar and money as well, which was very important. He was taking currency to those people within the Jewish community in East Berlin that needed it. So he was seen as almost like a savior. So once the wall had come down and you got the reunification of Berlin itself as a city and the country as a whole in the early 90s, he was quite rightly hailed as a hero for the country itself. And he went to many ceremonies. He gave he sang the main song, gave us the main prayer at the Shoah commemorations in Berlin once the city had been unified. So I tried to tell his story because I thought it was very important.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing this. This is a really special story, and we should go to the Q&A now, but I want to finish with one final question, and that is, of course, the fall of the Berlin Wall, November 9th, 1989, was greeted with a lot of enthusiasm, etc. But then already very quickly afterwards, there were feelings of resentment from both sides, which has been described as the phenomenon of the wall in the heads. And my question to you is, how do you see this aftermath? And maybe also in conclusion, what would you say is the enduring legacy of the Berlin Wall?
Okay, so we go to the next slide, please. This shows you West Berliners clapping in East Berliners in their Trabants, their famous cars, as they came through. The picture that I got from people that I interviewed that witnessed the gates opening on both sides that night on November 9th, and then going into the preceding, the next few days, the majority of East Berliners were generally just coming over just to view this Western paradise that they dreamt of going to, and that they now could have free access to. So they just wanted to, for themselves, see what it looked like and try and buy some of these goods that they just didn't have the opportunity to buy in an East Berlin or an East German shop. Things like bananas, for instance, kiwi fruit, that kind of thing. And it's turned into an urban legend, but it's actually true from the people I've spoken to anyway, that a lot of these goods we now take for granted were sold out in a lot of West Berlin shops because the East Berliners were just coming over and emptying them out and obviously taking them back to East Berlin to their families to have, try this and eat this banana and that kind of thing. And like I said, a lot of East Berliners I interviewed said, I had work the next day, I had to get back. So there was that kind of thing. But obviously, as you just mentioned, is as time went on, obviously, I suppose it's like anything. You've got one tribe here, you've got one tribe there, and ultimately some of them aren't going to get on. And as you've got, I would argue, say for instance, the construction industry, there was a boom in East Berlin, and the majority of the workers, once the wall had come down and they're all one country, it's going to East Europeans and East Germans and East Berliners because they'll pay them a lot less than they would West Germans. Equally, when they go over into West Germany, they would accept slightly lower wages than their West German counterpart, because to them, they're still earning a lot of money. Their earning power quadrupled, you could argue, in those first, 5 to 10 years. And there has been, again, talking to people that are there now that have reported on it, which I talk about in the book, is there is still a brain drain going from East Germany into West Germany, but it's a natural one. It's not from political oppression or anything like that. It's just the West German industry is still years ahead in some respects of what's going on in East German towns and cities. And so the jobs are there, the pay's better. They've obviously got access more quickly to going into other countries that are in Western Europe. So there's that kind of resentment. It's getting slowly better, but it's almost 2 generations, more than 2 generations of the country being split in half. And it will take more than 2 generations to heal those kind of wounds and to have the infrastructure maybe balanced. It'll probably take a lot longer than that. And that's what needs to happen. And you can see that mirroring in what's going on politically at the moment too.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. And we'll move to the Q&A. Maybe we can, yeah, perfect, get back to this. And the first question is by Zoe T. I just wondered what Iain's sense is whether Berliners thought the wall was temporary or not in 1961, and how long it took to sink in that it wasn't going anytime quickly.
I can only judge it by the people that I interviewed. They thought it was, well, some of the ones I interviewed anyway, thought it was happening in their locale. It wasn't spread right across the city, because obviously in those days, there's no internet, there's no 24 rolling news, there's no mobile phones. You just got what's going on in front of you. But as the situation got bigger and bigger and people were starting to not panic, well, the panic was subsiding to find out what exactly is going on. What are the Allies doing? What are the West Berlin police doing? Are they invading us? Is that what's happening? So as soon as that kind of level of panic died down, it was then a kind of acceptance of, well, this is our fate right now, but I'm sure the Allies are going to do something about it. But then when that didn't happen, then it goes up to another level. And there was a gradual, almost like a roller coaster of emotions over that first, I'd say, 4 to 6 months of the Berlin Wall going up. As in, what's going to happen? Is it going to crank up? Is it going to go down? It goes down, but then something else happens, and then other things happen. And it was how the Allies managed to keep West Berlin morale going in that first year. And that's why you've got Kennedy sending the vice president over with a goodwill message to say, we haven't forgot you. Lyndon Baines Johnson famously went there. And why they then sent a battle group down the Autobahn from West Germany into West Berlin. It was all these kind of things that were happening to try and make sure that the city itself didn't feel like it was forgotten. And because if it did, and morale did plummet, it would be a more easier option for the East Germans to then say, well, the city's going to be ours anyway. We're going to take it.
Right. Okay. Ian, I am going to ask you to keep your answers concise for the following questions, because we have a lot.
We'll do. Right. One sentence each.
Okay, perfect. So the next one is by Riccardo Zanettini, and he asks, how accurate is, in your opinion, the representation of Berlin displayed in the 2015 Tom Hanks movie Bridge of Spies?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite accurate. I mean, it's obviously telling it from a different story. I actually published the Bridge of Spies book in my job, by the way. But yeah, it's just telling you it from one angle. I would argue that the East Germans weren't as incompetent as they portray them in the film. That's the only thing that rankles me. Right.
Okay. Deborah Weinrauch asks, was there a space of land between the wall bordering East Berlin and the wall bordering West Berlin? And if so, were there landmines or other deterrents in the space?
No, there was definitely a space between where the final wall finished, because obviously all the barriers were built inside East German territory. That's why the Allies couldn't intervene. And there was a kind of no man's land of about 20 meters from the wall to the Allied positions. And I mean, the East Germans were very ingenious. There was a couple of they had hidden doors in the wall that they could definitely go out into that no man's land and grab people if they were there, and it did happen. But there were no landmine. Once you got past the wall, there was no other lethal weaponry to get past to then get to freedom.
Okay, great. Thomas Halvorsen writes, can you say anything about the military strength in West Berlin? How long would they be able to defend the western part of Berlin in case of an attack from the east?
It numbered about 10,000 military personnel spread between the French, British and Americans altogether. A very sizable battle group. I mean, they were armed to the teeth. They had tanks. They had a couple of tank squadrons there as well. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, the British commander in 1989, who I interviewed extensively for the book, Robert Corbett, said to me, oh, we wouldn't have stood a chance, but we would have put up a hell of a fight. Our job was to just ensure that the Allies in the West had enough time or had enough warning before the Warsaw Pact rolled over them.
Right. The next one is an easy one for you by Laurent Petzela. Can you explain the reason that they named it Checkpoint Charlie?
It was when you've got the 3 checkpoints. You've got the West Germany going into East Germany checkpoint Alpha, the checkpoint that you would then reach once you've crossed East Germany to get into West Berlin itself. It's Hinterland, checkpoint Bravo. And then the final checkpoint that got you into East Berlin was checkpoint Charlie. That's the only reason.
A simple ABC.
Yep.
David Foster asks, how porous was the wall to intelligence agents crossing?
I would, again, I'm only doing it from people I talk to. the East Germans and the Russians had a very, very good network of surveillance in East Berlin and in East Germany. Very, very difficult to get spies, agents through there and set up networks, practically impossible. There's more, I give more credence to the military intelligence guys from all three Allied countries who did the work in East Germany and in the hinterland around East Berlin. I mean, it was a city of spies, but it wasn't porous by any stretch of the imagination.
Right, right. Mats Hansen asks, do you know how the 1988 Bruce Springsteen concert in East Berlin was staged and organized? Did the East Germans call Springsteen, or did Springsteen call them and ask to play?
Well, there's a whole chapter on it in my book, so I'm not going to tell everyone the story. So you have to buy the book. He was on his Tunnel of Love tour, and it just so happened that the East German government approached them. It was some of their younger members in the party had suggested that he was a working class blue collar guy. It might appeal more to the younger East Germans if they got someone like him to come over with the kind of music he was playing. They just underestimated how many people were going to turn up to watch him.
Right. Next question is by Liz Sondhaus, and she asked, can you say more about Erich Honecker's role in building the wall? Did his role help him politically in East Germany?
Well, yeah, because the building of the wall was called Operation Rose, and he was its architect. So the plans might have been signed off by Ulbricht with Khrushchev in Moscow, but the job was given to Honecker to actually implement it. He was in charge of the whole thing. He was driving around East Berlin for 2 or 3 days to all the checkpoints, to all the troops, trying to improve morale, making sure things were done on time. He was completely behind it. And obviously, if you achieve something like that, your reputation is going to skyrocket.
Right. Next question is by Ray Cunningham, and with an eye on the time, I'm going to shorten it a little bit. So I think the core question is, can you say something about the role of artists and musicians in bringing the wall down?
Yeah, well, in terms of the people's protests that were going on in East Germany, they were very, very important. So the peace protest that slowly built momentum from the early 80s all the way through to 89 was full of lots of different people from lots of different jobs, but the arts and media industry and religion too, the official church, they were the real drivers of the peace protests in East Berlin and East Germany itself, and they were the ones that really put pressure on the government by 1989. So I would say they should be given just as much praise as anyone else for the barriers coming down peacefully without bloodshed.
Right. Angie Drew says the wall was not known as the wall in East Germany, but did the other Eastern Bloc countries use the term wall?
Yeah, they would have done. Well, it was the anti-fascist barrier. That's what it was called in East Germany. And that's what you were educated as a child in East Germany. That's what it was called. And it was there for a reason. It's almost like a dam to protect us all from these fascist hordes that want to get in and destroy our paradise. And I would imagine to ordinary people in the Eastern Bloc, they had the same kind of education, but everyone knew what it was for. Right.
There's another question that asks about the difference in landscape between the East and the West, and I guess East and West Berlin especially, because it mentions even considering gentrification, is it still visible? Are there still visible differences between East and West?
Yeah, there is. I mean, if you go into East Germany, it's definitely East Berlin. There's definitely even though with all the restoration that's gone on, and it looks amazing, and you go down the central district of Mitte, it's fantastic. I love going there. But you go into some of the side streets and into the other districts further out, you can completely picture this is what it was like. I mean, there's still graffiti up there. In some places, you'll find pockmarked bullet holes from when the Russians invaded the city. And there's still a kind of more relaxed atmosphere on the eastern side.
Okay, great. I want to conclude with two final questions. One is, did the SED, the leading party in East Germany, government exploit Armstrong's 1965 visit to East Berlin for propagating the GDR support for American civil rights movement?
I'm sure they would have. I would need to do more research on that. That wasn't a factor that, of something that I put in my book. I just found it in the research. I'm a big jazz fan, so to me it was really, really interesting. But as you see with Bruce Springsteen, there was lots of stars went over there over the years.
Right. Okay, thank you. And then finally, did surveillance of East German citizens by the Stasi predate the wall, or did the wall trigger the extensive tracking of the citizens?
Oh, yeah, the Stasi was surveillance from 53 onwards, when you had the workers' uprising in East Germany, which took the government by surprise, almost toppled it without the Russians intercept it, well, coming in to support them and putting it down. From 53 onwards, they realized we really need to keep a lid on our population. So the influence and budgets for the Stasi massively increased, and that's where you ended up having the surveillance state it was by 1989.
Right. Iain, I want to thank you very, very much for this very lively and informative conversation.
Thank you.
And I apologize for the non-answered questions because of the time. Next week, we have an Art Past Present interview co-hosted by Farah Karapetian with Afro-futurist and surrealist artist Shel Barber, who is also represented both in our Medea Insurrection exhibition and our current Transformations exhibition. And then the week thereafter, March 24th, I'm speaking with Sarah Blaylock on alternative spaces in East Germany, looking at the unofficial East German art scene. So I hope to see you again the coming weeks and wish you a wonderful time.